So a lot of rules. So I was playing with a lot of rules. So I always saw rules to break. That was how I started. And then I began to study, and I studied law. Isn't it weird? That is because I thought I want to make use of the law, empowerment, make things possible, give people rights. So I tried to,
You got to know the rules so you can break them simply.
yeah, and also to make use of them.
Yeah.
So that's where it started. But it also shows that I've always tried to look for flexibility. You need a frame, you need a rule, but you also need flexibility. That's you can live more freely. Like in nature, you can have a garden, but there's always some wildness in there. If you look at the Dutch farms, it's always very neat and straight and boxes, but it should be more natural. And I think the natural way is allowing more flexibility. And I use those principles in climate change policies, where we will speak about soon.
Okay, so yes, because climate policies and you're a carbon specialist. You're with a company called Anthesis in the Netherlands. You're also active. It's a quite big company. You are what is it, 1,400 people or something like that?
Yeah, 1,400 people, 20 somewhat offices, all regions. They work a lot on ESG issues, product carbon footprints, climate policies, carbon projects, and helping meeting the climate targets. That's what we are here for, making impact, but also, well, staying in business, because without business, we don't meet our targets either.
Probably what has just been announced within the EU, the 2040 target here, and because Europe still is having a leading role in this space of carbon credits, ETS, so all the various abbreviations and acronyms are there, and trying to pursue that role. And can you, first of all, let's start with the 2040. What does it entail, first of all?
Well, the EU already had this target to become climate neutral in 2050, compared to 1990. Is that 100% then? And there was already a target for 2030, that is 62%. So they were looking for a middle target in 2040, and that's 90%, on the way to climate neutral. I think it's science-based. It's the most ambitious region with regard to climate. The EU is a very interesting animal. It's not left, not right. If you look at the Green Deal, it's covering all these sectors, and more you see that the carbon market is more and more being used. Because I think, frankly, for governments, especially the cap and trade system, is the preferred system. Because you have just one budget for all the companies involved, and it slowly is decreasing the budget up to zero. So that would be the best system, which works easily for big polluters, energy industry. Slowly, it also works for transportation sector and buildings in an upstream system. So not only the producers of oil of fuels will be kept, the cap and trade, but also the selling of the fuels to the market. So more and more you see the regulatory carbon market growing, and it seems to work in the EU because it always is allowing some compromise, some flexibility. There's a price, but that's not the target. The target is lower emissions. It's also trying to include that companies will still be in business later. So this 2040 target is very interesting at the moment, because more and more, if you go near 2050 to zero, it's becoming more and more difficult. Higher costs, higher risks. So what the commissioner proposed, after negotiation with other countries, of course, is to allow some more flexibility. You know, I like flexibility. There are a few flexibilities. Let's spec them out a little bit. One flexibility is that they say, well, the EU ETS, that's the cap and trade system of the EU, including 10,000 companies, industries, and the power sector. We see that in 2040, 2050, there still will be residual emissions. There still be some gas, some oil, some methane for hard to abate sectors. And to compensate those remaining emissions, the EU would like to link that to carbon removals in the EU. So if you remove CO2 from the atmosphere, in the soil or in buildings or in aquifers, then it is negative emissions that can nicely compensate for the remaining emissions. So that's one flexibility. And it will be a very tough system. European certificates need to be verified, etc., etc. We're going to test that. So that's the first flexibility. The other one is making use of the global carbon market, just 3% in 2036, more or less. That's already big. It's 150 million ton. It's not nothing. It's just a start. Only 3% of the remaining emission reductions. Why do they do that? Firstly, to build a global bridge to get really developing countries also on the side for more investments to involve them in carbon reductions. And also many of the supply chains involve developing countries like cocoa, coffee. So why not make them part of the journey? And in last climate conference in Baku, that was really finally adopted by all countries. Okay, we can use the carbon market to help countries meet their targets. You may not like it, but it's part of the toolbox. And there are two tools the Paris Agreement is providing. The one is there's an issuing body. It's called the PACM. The supervisory body will decide on, after a methodology, submission of the registration, do the project verification, then issue those certificates. That will be a very ambitious issuing system because, the country has to prove that he's not only, for example, capturing landfill gas and turning that into power, avoiding methane, but that he's also preparing a transition in this country, and that more and more landfill gas should be captured, as just an example. Because otherwise, if you do for eternity carbon projects without improving your policies, then you can keep on compensations. You don't want that. So that's one of the ambition parts of the first start using the global carbon market. And the second part is it's also possible, and you see that with Switzerland and Sweden, but also Norway and South Korea and Singapore, that you can have also bilateral deals. For example, Switzerland is investing in reductions in Thailand, for example, electric buses, or Cuxos in Peru. And a part of those reductions, they will then be subtracted from the national report and will transfer to Switzerland to help meet their target.
Okay.
And that's more like a bilateral frame. So it's not an issuing body, it's more in control. Well, those are some of the flexibilities the EU would like to start with. And I think it's a good idea. We talked already 3 decades about it. So let's harvest what we have and improve it.
That's great. But one thing that many people talk about, what we have addressed so far, is the different scopes, right? Scope 1, Scope 2, Scope 3. And a lot of legislation is too much focused on Scope 1 and perhaps Scope 2, whilst in many sectors, the big emissions are actually in Scope 3.
Yeah.
And that is also being included somehow going forward in this framework or other frameworks?
Indirect, you might say. At least that would be my preferred route. So if a company is allowed to use 3% of its emission reductions through carbon markets, I would then choose to invest in a country where I have my supply chain, where my farmers work for my clothes, for example, and then also reduce my own Scope 3 emissions. That would be my preferred route. But it could also be indirectly. So a lot of the Scope 3 is in developing countries. That's what it is. And that can be tackled. It's not mentioned yet in the EU's policy framework. You might say that part of the Scope 3 is covered under the ETS, the cap and trade system. As I said earlier, when you bring fuels to the market to warm houses or to fuel cars, that upstream system, you might see this as Scope 3 of the refineries. That's also part of the cap and trade system number 2. So, and I fully agree with you. There has been a lot of attention to the plants, Scope 1, and the power. That's pretty good captured already. But what about the smaller companies, part of the supply chain, the recycling, the agriculture? That's not enough part of it. On the other hand, Scope 3 is also somebody's Scope 1.
Yes.
And so we need to find a way how to involve the smaller companies. Again, we can work together. We can have insetting. That means you work together in a supply chain, paid by the buyer, for example. So we need to find a way to get them involved. And it's very interesting. I always advise my colleagues when the company is asking again, let's start with 1 scope and 2. I say, no, you have to start with scope 3 as well, because nature will be happy, people will be happy in the climate. It has a lot of impact and co-benefits. And I think that has maybe not been part of the 2040 package yet. So if you prepare climate policies or impact in your supply chain, always look for co-benefits. If it's also good for your own soils, healthy soils, you have more yield, more production, and also climate. So that's a great combination. And then it might also be possible to find co-finance if you find companies or investors willing in replanting mangroves that protect coastal zones, but also brings more water or more fisheries. You see a lot of values can be combined. And maybe even in the future, that's my small hope, carbon will be maybe in the future be the co-benefit. And you invest in nature, you invest in habitation, and by the way, it's also good for carbon. Well, isn't it a perfect dream we take out of this package of the EU's proposal?
But I'm very happy to hear that you see this as positive, and it can turn into some vehicles that is good in so many aspects. So, very great. Eric.
I was just really enjoying. I always love.
I saw that.
I always love to feel I'm learning, and I think our listeners who are typically split between young people and energy leaders, I'm pretty sure learning alongside us here today. From the outside, Jos, you make it sound very accessible, but I would argue it's for the outside Europe, regulation is seen as quite complex. Every time there are a lot of small print. Still, Europe is leading through regulation, setting global standards. I think carbon, my perception, and welcome to hear your view in a moment, is through this carbon cap and trade system, Europe is still leading the world, whilst, let's say, United States, it seems, is saying goodbye to Paris Agreement and looking at carbon and choosing much more focus just on energy for its competitiveness. Whilst Europe now is taking a combination. They're saying, yes, we have attention to competitiveness of our industry. That's where we are providing flexibility. But we have the courage to look to the world also ahead of the climate conference and to say 2040, it's going to be less. We are thinking how to make it easier to reach those targets, but we are not abandoning the targets. We're not changing the direction of travel. We're just being more pragmatic about how we are building a green industrial road for our industry. And what Europe is also doing is it's building a carbon wall. They call it CBAM, carbon border adjustment, to protect its industries, right? And I think opinions are divided, and we were just a bit ahead of the start of the show discussing. It looks like I am in the camp which thinks, well, CBAM is a good carbon wall. And maybe Jos, you, and maybe even Joachim, you guys in the camp where you say, well, Eric, it's not necessarily the best idea that came out of Europe. So I would be curious about two things to hear from you, Jos, and then after passing back to Joachim. First, are we still, leaders in the global carbon debate? And is CBAM part of that leadership, or should we perhaps put some critical adjustments to it?
Yeah. No, I'm not a lover of CBAM, neither is Joachim, okay? The reason is, in the press, it's being said, now everybody needs to pay a price, not only the EU. That sounds strange, doesn't it? It doesn't really work like that. And I think you have to make a choice first. Do you want that climate change policy is very expensive, or do you want to limit costs? If you want to make it expensive and have no more free allowances anymore in the EU, so that every industry, aluminum, steel, has to pay the allowances, then the costs are higher. Yeah, maybe then you should have a tax at the border. But first, you don't even need to have all the industries pay for those allowances, as long as they meet the target. That's the first thing. And I remember that years ago, Diederik Samson, that was helping Mr. Timmermans, saying, well, I don't only want a level playing field, I want a higher level playing field. Yeah, he means a more costlier play field, right? And I really like a lower play field just to meet a target. So that's one thing. And the second is the rest of the world really sees this CBAM as protectionist. Because the United Nations decided that it's up to developing countries to take a target. They will have some more time. And then suddenly EU says, now you can only trade with us if you have a higher target. That doesn't work like that. And also, the trade might then move to other countries from Asia. And that's easy to be done. You try to avoid costs. Still, it has a good. It had good impact. The European Commission is saying wherever we come, they want to talk about CBAM. I think it's good, but the impact is the following: that countries like Turkey say, "Well, I can also develop my own cap and trade system," because if you have a similar cap and trade system, you can discuss the prices. Then you import steel from Turkey, also with a CO2 price, and then it's okay, right? And if that's the intention of the EU, that's great. That why don't you just say it? Huh? And that it's not about leveling the price, but helping to meet targets so that the steel you import also has a lower footprint. And that is that's under development, because of course China and India and others are going to WTO. They say I don't like this. I can decide my own reduction path. And the EU is then obliging me to do it faster and higher cost. Doesn't work.
I still one thing in between, Jos. I was in Baku at the climate conference in a party of carbon people involved with carbon, and talked to some people, for example, from India there, and they told me like they build a whole business around helping Indian companies understand CBAM.
Of course.
And so I was really impressed that something that before, well, not many cared about, suddenly, indeed, like you just described, moved a number of countries to design cap and trade system. Okay, it's probably an unintended effect, but even in this way, I would argue, well, that's actually not a bad effect from the climate perspective.
But it's from the Trump camp. I prefer to be nice for developing countries, and I'm not in the Trump camp. And if you look how Germany always positioned themselves, they said, we don't like CBAM so much. We like a carbon club. You remember that? A climate club. And they meant that we would like to work together with G20 country so that everybody's using cap and trade systems. We can trade amongst each others so that we decarbonize our industry, like a common effort. And I think indirectly, this will happen anyway. I don't think countries will pay CBAM taxes. Do you think the US will pay CBAM tax? Do you think China will? I doubt. They will find a way to prevent it, or by making washing machines with renewable energy, or by a CO2 price in Turkey. It's okay. So it will work that way. And I think that's good. Now, also the carbon removal community is getting awake. Hey, maybe the CBAM helps us so that companies and countries invest in removals so that you can link the steel you import on a CDR, carbon removal certificate. So it has good impacts. So I think if we look further in 5 years, I don't think any company will pay the CBAM tax. But in the meantime, we had 3 things. First is that we have the carbon footprint of all the CO2 import, all the steel import, which is good because insight shows I can do it more efficient. So all the consultants you saw in Baku are helping countries, companies to what is the impact, what is the carbon footprint of the steel, aluminum you import or fertilizer, and that's good. And then if you realize you have not a very efficient production, you try to avoid using less power. So it's a good impact. And the second is that those regions that import can implement their own cap and trade system. That's what we also wanted. So I think in the end, I don't see many to pay those taxes. Although I would prefer to do it more nicely, Let's talk about carbon credits, because now we talked about the mandatory cap and trade system and the EU ETS, and you know that around 20% of the global CO2 emissions are already part of a cap and trade system, which is good. As I said earlier, it's the preferred approach of advanced countries. Then what to do then with the other sectors? For example, in the EU, the agriculture sector, maybe transportation, some smaller or buildings. You can maybe combine projects to cap and trade system, domestic offsets. We've heard it earlier. That's being built in the EU. That's the carbon removal certification framework, on BECCS, on direct air capture, biochar a little bit, removals in buildings. So that domestic offset mechanism will hopefully soon be linked to the ETS. So if you cap and trade system, and the remaining emissions can be maybe compensated with negative emissions. That's great. On the global level, there's still a lot of reductions we need to make. As I said earlier, the Commission decided, hopefully you can agree on that, to allow for 3% of the remaining reductions needed for 2040 using Paris Agreement carbon credits. But we really need to make it happen. Sometimes I see in the press a lot of requirements that I think, well, that's a big burden for developing countries. Huh? If you say, I want to do a cook-stove project in Ethiopia, but you need to have a transition plan. You need to show when your renewables is coming from. And you also need to have all your national emissions reported and then adjust your emissions if I buy something. That's a lot of burden. I doubt if they're already there. So in the meantime, we can still use the voluntary carbon market. And, I'm also a fan of that. Huh? The voluntary carbon market is always a proxy for regulatory carbon market. That's fine. But I really sense that most developing countries are still at the voluntary carbon market level, which is okay. It brings finance. You learn how projects work. And you have a price for that. And you involve developing countries. And slowly, you can then graduate into Article 6 carbon market. And that's why you see that Norway, Sweden, and Switzerland, as I said earlier, prefer to use Article 6.2. That means you have a bilateral agreement, and that in the agreement, like an umbrella, still companies from Norway can invest in Ethiopia, do projects, but under that umbrella. So that both countries decide, the rule of the game, what is additional, and that you can then move much faster. Mm-hmm. So if there's a lot of complaints about Article 6.4 in developing countries, it will not go so fast. So let's forget something. We don't even get 3% so easy, but let's at least allow it. Let's check it. Let's have not too much burdens on developing countries. We need to learn there. And that will be my advice on how to make use of this flexibility.
Great. Jos, I have a very simple, very straightforward question. What is the right price that you would like to see that would give this dynamics in the carbon markets? Is it 50 euro? Is it 100 euro, 200 euro, 300 euro, 800 euro? What is it? Because you spent a good deal of time looking at this and thinking of it, I think, in ways that not many people have done. And we hear very many different numbers being thrown around. So
it's almost $1 million question, but I will do it cheaper for you.
Thank you.
In the EU, 10,000 companies are part of the cap and trade system. They need to comply. And the price is now like 70 euro, maybe 80 euro per ton. So that is the compliance price. And by helping to meet that target, 0 in 2050, that's all in line with 1.5 degrees, you avoid those impacts. You can see if you calculate the social cost of carbon. You may have heard about the social cost of carbon. That is the cost for humanity if we don't meet the targets, harvest loss, people loss, etc., land loss. That's a high cost. You would like to avoid that. But to avoid that, you don't need to pay that price. You want to avoid it. You need to comply with the targets. So for me, more important is the compliance price for mandatory carbon markets. But if you go to the voluntary carbon market, I'm so sad all the time. There's so much complaints about the low quality. Well, then pay a higher price. You need a verification, buffer, whatever. So many requirements that requires a higher price. And maybe 50 euro per ton might be good also for a nice cook-stove project with all co-benefits. And also with our company, it's very difficult to get that price. And then the question is, but how do we get the quality? You need the verification, the monitoring, the set aside, the buffer, correction factors, calculation, uncertainties. If you pay a higher price, we can do that. And that's the irony at the moment. People are not very happy with the current quality for carbon credits, but they're also not willing to pay a higher price. Then on the far end, you see the move to more expensive projects, like direct air capture. Mm-hmm. And it's more like an investment project that goes for 1,500 euro per ton, for example, and BECCS for 300 euro per ton. that's really an investment in future projects. It's not really tradable at the moment. But what you see there is it's direct air capture. It seems a very safe investment. There's no people involved, no nature involved, no problems, But I would like to prefer to also do the projects where people and nature is involved, because that needs investment. So it looks as if companies are going towards like a perfect project type for carbon credits in isolation, where nobody hurts, but nobody's helped either. And I think, therefore, the discussion driven by the EU now on having at least 3% use in carbon markets, have that discussion. And there's no safe haven. There always will be discussion. And I think there's never a carbon market NGOs will love. They will always hate it because they say, how can you use oil and have offsets? They say, if you still have oil, you're not allowed to use offsets, more or less. But we also know it's too early to use only renewable power, renewable gas. It's not there yet. So as long as we have to use oil and gas and coal, you also need to allow offsets, because otherwise you don't meet the target. You may not like it. And I think, of course, we need to move towards more renewables. Of course, I would love to have that. But as long as we don't have that, you need to use the flexibility.
I love that, particularly through today's episode. I learned that this 3% is actually 150 million tons a year. So in my mind, I already multiplied that with 100 euros. So that's easily 1.5 billion euro of opportunity starting 2036 every year again and again. So that's quite okay. It's not huge, but it's already more finance than what I remember has been agreed in Baku to help international community move forward. So I think that's already just a very, very, very good gesture by Europe on the table for the upcoming Brazil summit. So, and I think project developers will be thinking, how can I create a project where part of my, like you said, supply chain perhaps is getting these credits, and they're integrated into Europe, even if it's from 36 onwards, because investments we're making now globally, also in supply chains, the factory, they're easily 10, 20 years. There is a time for construction. So, 2036 is already in the Excel sheets, financial models of some of their investments. European companies, for example, are making globally. I can imagine even Joachim's company, Linde, will be one of those thinking about such things. So I think that's already just, opportunity right there for people to start thinking, how can we start shaping this? I think that's super interesting. In a moment, we'll be going towards the coffee machine. From my side, I wonder if our young people will be getting in touch with you, Jos, and with others involved in carbon on the way to climate summit in Brazil, and saying, I have ideas how to shape those 3% globally between Europe in our countries. I think that would be really interesting. I don't know, Jos, from your side, what would you like for people at the coffee machine to think about globally?
Especially coffee, If you reward the farmers for biochar addition on the soil, which stores carbon and makes the soil more healthier, if you invest and give rewards for farmers to do more agroforestry, well, then the carbon footprint of your coffee is much lower, and you help the climate and you reward nature and farmer. That's a perfect example. And I think earlier when you said that companies need to make a good selection where to invest in, I think they will preferably invest in their own supply chain because there's control. They also do it in their own interest. It's not just a tumble, you just, I want a certificate. No, it should be a sustainable investment so that farmers will invest in regenerative farming and ecosystems. So offsets, it's not like a certificate and that's it. No, it should be something annually. You want permanence, and you can organize it, the type of permanent project. And it's not only removals, also sustainable farming and things like that. So on the coffee machine, I would make it very nearby to your cup of coffee. Where's it coming from? There's a lot of emissions involved. You don't want to have less coffee. So there's a farmer somewhere. The same with clothing. Often it involves cotton or whatever. farmers are in the need for healthier soils, a bigger reward socially and environmentally. So that's the good way of offset. It's not really offsetting, more or less. So if you buy solar panels from China, we don't see that offsetting. We see now you invest in reductions. So, and also investing in healthier soils is also not offsetting, it's reductions. So, and we need to get rid of the old frames like the backdoor, easy way, offsetting, and reduction is always better. Offsetting is often reductions. So I'm happy that young people are listening now, and hopefully we have packaged out what is offering by the EU, and start thinking about reductions. We need all kinds of reductions, not only in the factory, also in roads, transportation, and carbon credits is a way of verifiable reductions with a good price and a good benefit sharing. And I think that's what the EU wants to start with, and I think it's a good start.
And we are setting a leadership. Joachim, do you want to close with few thoughts, the coffee machine?
I love talking about coffee, and I think it's a great example. What I also love is the positive energy Jos is conveying around something that many people consider as a terribly boring topic. And it doesn't have to be. It doesn't have to be. And included in that, which I take very positive personally even, is that one thing that I always disliked about the EU, even when I've been very positive about the EU, certainly, is this thinking that I call the fortress. It is fortress thinking that comes many times. But what you show here is that this is not the fortress thinking with this 2040. It's opening up. You go fortress to 2040, right? A bit of alliteration here, which is great because this is a global thing and we need to work on this together. And my second takeaway is a kind of derivative of that one, maybe your examples of these bilateral things, how you can invest in your own upstream, which I consider as something extremely good to do, because with that integrated approach of your own supply chain, you're helping in both ends. And if we can have legislations and markets that are promoting this type of behavior, at the end of the day, we even promote peace, which is very, very important as well. So those are my great takeaways, and I'm using the coffee as the example. Yeah.
So through carbon offsets to peace. I love that. And I'd like to toast with a glass of water to this episode and say thank you to Jos for being on the episode, to Joachim and to myself for enjoying with live energy the carbon market stories from Jos, and hopefully our listeners look forward to reconnect soon again. Jos, thank you again.
Positive carbon markets for the future. That's great.
Awesome.
Thanks for helping me to unpack this box and to crack the carbon code. See you.
Bye.
Cheers. Thank you.